Hello everybody and welcome to another video on the unfolding saga behind the movie It Ends With Us and what are now dueling lawsuits between the stars Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. I did a video on this a couple of weeks ago and I didn't necessarily plan to do a follow-up, but there have been so many twists and turns in the story, and as I said in the first video, I'm not here necessarily to talk about gossip. There is so much of this case that involves the production side of Hollywood, the industry side of Hollywood, and as someone who covers the entertainment industry, I felt like there was enough about that to warrant a second video. If you want a primer on how all of this began, then I suggest that you watch my first video on this, which you can find up there at the link above. Just before the new year, on New Year's Eve, Justin Baldoni filed a $250 million lawsuit against the New York Times for publishing an article that we covered in that previous video that dropped alongside Blake Lively's complaint against him, accusing the paper of collaborating with Lively and her allies to publish a libelous article without allotting those accused of wrongdoing in the article the proper time to respond. Baldoni filed suit along with his production company Wayfarer, as well as producer of It Ends With Us, Jamie Heath, Wayfarer financier Steve Sarowitz, Crisis PR rep Melissa Nathan and her company, Baldoni's publicist Jennifer Abel and her company, and Jed Wallace, who was named in Lively's suit and the story as a specialist who executed an astroturfing campaign against the actress. In the suit, Baldoni's lawyers write, quote, "In its rush to publish a one-sided, unsubstantiated story on behalf of Lively, the Times got it dramatically wrong. The aftershocks have been disastrous for plaintiffs, and they now, reluctantly and knowing the damage cannot be fully undone, bring suit to hold the Times accountable for this egregious misfire." In the suit, the plaintiffs accuse the New York Times of libel and false slight invasion of privacy, as well as promissory fraud and breach of an implied contract, which stems from the Times publishing their story earlier than the time that they told the plaintiffs, which they said cut down on the response time and the time that they were able to rebut the claims that were made in the story. And Baldoni's lawyers further say, quote, "Notably, Lively chose not to file a lawsuit against Baldoni, Wayfarer, or any of the plaintiffs, a choice that spared her from the scrutiny of the discovery process, including answering questions under oath and producing her communications. Instead, Lively filed a request for a right to sue letter with the California Civil Rights Department, CRD, a procedural formality that does not require pleadings, remains confidential unless leaked, as it was here, and crucially does not subject the complainant to discovery. While such a letter can precede a lawsuit, it is clear that litigation was never her ultimate goal." Well, that turned out not to be the case, because later, on the same day that Baldoni filed his lawsuit against the New York Times, Blake Lively followed up her initial complaint by suing Baldoni and his team in a New York court for sexual harassment and retaliation for orchestrating a smear campaign that she alleges harmed her career. The suit mirrors almost exactly the contents of the civil rights complaint that Lively filed earlier in the month. In Baldoni's later civil suit, his lawyers wrote that they believe that Lively only filed the civil lawsuit because her clients didn't back down, essentially, that they called her bluff. Baldoni's lawyers wrote, quote, "On information and belief, Lively never intended to file a civil lawsuit, which would have triggered plaintiff's right to discovery, including obtaining evidence and deposing Lively under oath. By the time Lively actually filed a lawsuit against plaintiffs, the damage to plaintiffs was done by virtue of Lively's months of colluding with the New York Times on a false and malicious narrative unshielded by any privilege." And yes, I did say the civil lawsuit against Lively because last week we had yet another development when Baldoni and the same plaintiffs from the New York Times suit filed another lawsuit, this time against Lively, her husband Ryan Reynolds, and Lively's publicist Leslie Sloan and her firm for $400 million, alleging that Lively's claims of sexual harassment were false, that they had evidence and documentation to back it up, that there was no smear campaign against Lively, that Lively and her publicist had actually executed a smear campaign against Baldoni, and that the entire matter was the result of Lively taking control of It Ends With Us from Baldoni, including the publicity tour, which resulted in harm to Lively's career because of her own poor choices while promoting the film. So we've gone from one legal complaint to now 3 different lawsuits, and I've read all 3 of them. There is a lot of information to go through, and I'm going to do my best to present the basics of it here, but as long as this video may be, I assure you, I'm just presenting the basic information here, the stuff that I feel is most relevant. If you want to read all 3 of those lawsuits, I encourage you to do so. They are all available to read online. In my first video, I went through Lively's initial complaint extensively, and given that her lawsuit against Baldoni doesn't contain any significant new information, a lot of the focus on this video is going to be on Baldoni's response in his suits against both the New York Times and Lively, Reynolds, etc. Where applicable, I may refer back to Lively's original filing as it relates to Baldoni's lawsuit, but I just want to make it clear again that my intent here is not to take one side or another. It's to present the information as clearly as I can. What's true and what's not true, who's lying and who's not lying, that now seems to be a task that will be put to multiple jury trials unless the parties decide to settle out of court. It's hard to know where to begin, so I guess it's best to start at the beginning when Lively was cast as the lead alongside Baldoni in the movie adaptation of It Ends With Us. Baldoni had spent several years previously directly acquiring the rights to make the book from author Colleen Hoover. And according to Baldoni, his working relationship with Lively was very good at first. But as the beginning of production got closer and closer, Baldoni claims that Lively began to assert herself more and more, at first wanting more control over the wardrobe for her character, and eventually requesting to rewrite the rooftop scene in the film where her character and Baldoni's character meet. Baldoni claims that he responded positively to Lively's rewrite, but told her that the finished version of the scene that would appear in the film would likely be a combination of her version and the version done by the screenwriters. And it's at this point where Lively's husband, Ryan Reynolds, enters the lawsuit, as well as an unexpected name, Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift is one of Lively's close friends, and Lively allegedly ran her rewrite by both Reynolds and Swift before sending it to Baldoni. Baldoni includes in his lawsuit texts allegedly from Lively, this is her writing, saying, quote, "When Reynolds and Swift loved and signed off on the pages, I felt good to send them to you. They asked what you thought specifically after. They checked in so many times. I told them that you laughed a bunch and said it's probably a blend, but you appreciate my passion so much," which of course didn't feel great for me or them. To have my passion be praised instead of any specific contribution, or even just that you didn't like the pages, which was fine also. I'm so lucky to have them as creative barometers, but also as the people who prop me up and make sure I'm seen for all I can and do offer, because they know firsthand all I contribute. They also know I'm not always as good at making sure I'm seen and utilized for fear of threatening egos or fear of affecting the ease of the process. They don't give a blank about that, and because of that, everyone listens to them with immense respect and enthusiasm. If you ever get around to watching Game of Thrones, you'll appreciate that I'm Khaleesi, and like her, I happen to have a few dragons. For better or worse, but usually for better, because my dragons also protect those I fight for. So really, we all benefit from those gorgeous monsters of mine. You will too, I can promise you. Baldoni claims that he believed the dragons comment was an implied threat, that Lively would use the influence wielded not only by herself but by Reynolds and Swift against him if need be. Personally, I think it reads more like her saying that they would protect him as well as her, but again, this is something that's going to be hashed out in court. Regardless, Baldoni claims that this influence was, in the long run, wielded against him, and Lively has not been shy about talking about the rewrites on the rooftop scene. At the premiere of the film, she told journalists that Reynolds himself wrote that scene, and that was a claim that spurred a legal inquiry from the film's distributor, Sony, because they were worried it could cause some sort of a union issue. Baldoni's suit claims that this initial rewrite request ballooned into even more once the film entered production, saying, quote, "Though Lively was loose and relaxed in her speech on set, she was increasingly stringent in the demands she imposed on the production. She rewrote her own dialogue constantly and took it upon herself to make unilateral changes to other characters' lines, effectively rewriting the script day by day. This pattern of domineering interference caused unending interruptions to the production process, leading to entirely unnecessary stress, chaos, and delays. It is well documented on film footage how frequently she requested changes and how, at every turn, Baldoni took her thoughts and, out of fear of repercussions from Lively and her allies, he consistently tried to accommodate them." These clashes between Baldoni and Lively were not just confined to production, though. Shortly before production began, Lively alleges that Baldoni, for lack of a better word, fat-shamed her. And this is an example of how you can read these two cases, the one from Lively and the one from Baldoni, and walk away with two completely different stories and different interpretations of the event. Here's how Lively described the fat-shaming event in her initial lawsuit. Quote, Mr. Baldoni also routinely degraded Ms. Lively by finding back-channel ways of criticizing her body and weight. A few weeks before filming began, and less than 4 months after Ms. Lively had given birth to her 4th child, Ms. Lively was humiliated to learn that Mr. Baldoni secretly called her fitness trainer without her knowledge or permission and implied that he wanted her to lose weight in 2 weeks. Mr. Baldoni told the trainer that he had asked because he was concerned about having to pick Ms. Lively up in a scene for the movie, but there was no such scene. Regarding the specific incident cited in Lively's suit, Baldoni's lawyers claim, quote, Baldoni, while training for a physically demanding scene in which his character Ryle would lift Lily, asked his trainer, who was introduced to him by Lively and oversaw his training for the film, how much Lively weighed. Baldoni, who suffers from back issues and has multiple bulging discs, made the inquiry to ensure he could safely perform the lift without injury. Unfortunately, the trainer relayed this information to Lively, who then informed Reynolds. The confrontation that followed was so aggressive that Baldoni felt compelled to offer repeated apologies despite his question being entirely reasonable and made in good faith. Following this incident, Lively refused to perform the lift scene even though it had already been rehearsed with a stunt double. The only reason the scene wasn't in the film is because Lively and Reynolds ensured that it was taken out of the film. In reading both lawsuits, for every incident like this that is directly addressed, the two sides don't read like differing accounts, they read like wholly different versions of the same event. For example, there is another alleged incident that occurred when It Ends With Us producer Jamie Heath entered Lively's trailer while she claims that she was in a state of undress. In Lively's original suit, the incident reads like this, quote, Mr. Heath arrived unannounced at Ms. Lively's hair and makeup trailer while she was topless and having body makeup removed by makeup artists. Ms. Lively told Mr. Heath that she was almost done and that they could meet once she was clothed. Mr. Heath, however, insisted that if she didn't allow him into her trailer to speak to him at that moment, then there would be no meeting with the other producers. Ms. Lively reluctantly agreed, but asked that Mr. Heath keep his back turned. A few minutes into the conversation, Ms. Lively noticed that Mr. Heath was staring directly at her while she was topless. When she called him out, Mr. Heath brushed it off as a habit of wanting to look at a person while speaking to them. But in the lawsuit filed by Baldoni, in which Heath is also a plaintiff, the incident is described completely differently. That suit says, quote, Heath was invited into her trailer for a meeting at her request while she was having makeup removed from her collarbone because she was not able to meet at another time. Her nanny, makeup artist, and assistant were present, and Lively was not topless, as she claims elsewhere, but was fully covered while either nursing or pumping breast milk. In this instance, he was instructed to turn away while they spoke and respectfully did so, while they figured out a time to meet with the other producers standing just outside the door, and as Heath pleaded with Lively to have the meeting the next morning to avoid her getting home late and losing shoot time the following day. While it is possible he inadvertently made eye contact at one point, he does not recall. Lively later mentioned he did, and it made her uncomfortable, to which he replied, quote, I'm so sorry, I really didn't realize. Lively responded, quote, I know you weren't trying to cop a look, and they moved on. These incidents apparently have witnesses that may be called on in court to testify as to what they saw and heard, but we don't have much direct evidence for these claims, so it's going to be a little bit tougher to litigate. However, Baldoni and his plaintiffs claim that they do have direct evidence for some of the incidents that occurred on set. One such incident involves alleged misconduct during the filming of a dance scene for a montage in the film. In Lively's original complaint, her lawyers wrote, quote, Mr. Baldoni and Ms. Lively were filming a slow dance scene for a montage in which no sound was recorded. Mr. Baldoni chose to let the camera roll and have them perform the scene, but did not act in character as Ryle. Instead, he spoke to Ms. Lively out of character as himself. At one point, he leaned forward and slowly dragged his lips from her ear and down her neck as he said, quote, it smells so good. None of this was remotely in character or based on any dialogue in the script, and nothing needed to be said because, again, there was no sound. Mr. Baldoni was caressing Ms. Lively with his mouth in a way that had nothing to do with their roles. When Ms. Lively later objected to this behavior, Mr. Baldoni's response was, quote, I'm not even attracted to you. I mentioned this exact incident in my first video, and it is a pretty damning account of some egregious behavior. But in his lawsuit, Baldoni claims something completely different. His lawyers wrote, quote, production was filming a romance montage of Lily and Ryle on their date. One of the producers played music to set the mood so the characters could slow dance. Lively, consistently unable to take direction, insisted she really liked the idea of the characters constantly talking. Baldoni, her director, and the film's assistant director, who was directing the scene, disagreed. As they were acting in this montage scene, Lively continued to break character and speak as herself rather than as Lily, which was extremely confusing for Baldoni, who was trying to balance directing the scene with his artistic vision while also acting in character while filming and trying to get Lively to do the same. Lively apologized for the smell of her spray tan and body makeup. Baldoni responded, quote, "It smells good," end quote, and continued acting, slow dancing as he believes his character would, with his partner, which requires some amount of physical touching. Lively incorrectly alleges that this scene was filmed without sound. Baldoni was wearing a microphone, and the entire exchange is captured on camera. If this is true, and Baldoni's lawyers can show in court that Lively either misrepresented or misinterpreted the situation, then that could be difficult for Lively's case, not because one incident being disproved or shown in a different light disproves all other incidents, but because it gives the legal team a little bit of leverage to cast doubt on the other incidents in the case. And I think that this could especially be useful, again, if this proves to be true, this claim of video evidence, in Baldoni's suit against the New York Times, which is specifically for libel or printing false information. Of all the claims that Baldoni makes in his lawsuit, this one is the most interesting to me because it is one of the few that offers concrete evidence to back up his case rather than hearsay or interactions between Baldoni and people that you think would have been on his side in this case. However, neither of Baldoni's suits completely refute what Lively has alleged in her lawsuit, including that she has witnesses on a few different occasions to Baldoni's alleged behavior, or that there were other complaints that were filed with Wayfair's HR department during the production of the film. And this middle ground is likely what will be hashed out in court should this reach a courtroom. The full lawsuit addresses many of the other onset incidents, but let's jump to a little bit after that to the resumption of shooting following the resolution of the writers and actors strikes, which caused a months-long break in the production of the film. Now, included in Lively's lawsuit was a list of 17 actions that were agreed to by Heath and Wayfair in order for production to resume, and these addressed her concerns and her allegations of what she says was sexual harassment on set. But according to Baldoni's lawsuit, Wayfair himself and producer Jamie Heath agreed to this list because they were steps that they considered unnecessary and simply essential in order to get back to work. In Baldoni's lawsuit, his lawyers say, quote, "The stunning list was drafted for the apparent purpose of insinuating or outright claiming that Baldoni, Heath, and others had engaged in sexually inappropriate conduct during filming. It was clear that Wayfair would have to sign the document as is, despite the falsity of its insinuations. The alternative was to lose millions of dollars, cost hundreds of people their jobs after they'd been out of work for months, and destroy their relationship with Sony. Nonetheless, the demands themselves were agreeable. Indeed, some were already in place." One of the items that was on Lively's list, as contained in her lawsuit and her filing, was the presence of an intimacy coordinator on set. According to the list that Lively provided, quote, "An intimacy coordinator must be present at all times when Blake Lively is on set. Scenes involving kissing, depictions of sexual intercourse, or any other physical touching must be contained in the screenplay as approved by Blake Lively, choreographed in advance in the presence of the intimacy coordinator, and may only proceed as choreographed with the consent of all participants in advance." Baldoni's suit counters this claim by alleging that not only was an intimacy coordinator already hired, but that Lively had declined to meet with the coordinator prior to production to choreograph the intimate scenes with Baldoni. Baldoni includes texts he exchanged with a producer containing screenshots of Lively declining a meeting in pre-production and saying she would, quote, "meet her when we start," end quote, production. Baldoni's suit claims, quote, "As a result, many sex scenes were not written with simultaneous collaboration and input from both Lively and the intimacy coordinator as Baldoni had long intended. In the end, Lively rejected all of the intimacy coordinator's proposals to rewrite the scenes herself. Most egregiously, Lively later used these circumstances, created entirely by her, to accuse Baldoni of insisting Lively do, quote, uncomfortable or, quote, gratuitous scenes that were in fact proposed by the intimacy coordinator and by all accounts very typical asks of any actor performing simulated sex scenes. This is well documented in handwritten notes Baldoni took during meetings with the intimacy coordinator and later read to Lively." Baldoni claims that he and Heath signed the demand letter for the coordinator and the other things that Lively requested because these were things that were already being done on the film, but that the choice to sign this letter was then later used against him. His lawsuit says, quote, "This acquiescence, given with the written caveat that Wayfarer disagreed with all the characterizations, was later used by Lively to falsely suggest an acknowledgement that there had not been an intimacy coordinator at all." Now, I don't think that this necessarily disproves anything in Lively's complaint because we don't know which scenes are being referred to in her lawsuit versus Baldoni's lawsuit, but the information that Lively allegedly was offered to meet with the intimacy coordinator and refused to do so certainly does mitigate her claims regarding the lack of one on a movie set. And of course, that information isn't included in her initial lawsuit because that is generally how lawsuits work. No lawyer is going to willingly include information in their lawsuit that could undercut the story or the case of their client. But that's why I say it's so important not to immediately jump to conclusions based on reading one side of the story or the other. These lawsuits are going to present the best case scenario for each of these two, and they may contain and probably do contain misleading information for or against both sides. It is the job of the courts now to parse through these suits and decide what's true and what's not true. There is a lot more of this case to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for this video. This episode is brought to you by Chubbies. We're all settling into our 2025 routine, so why not settle into it in style with Chubbies? You may not know this, but Chubbies doesn't just make great shorts and swimsuits, they also make great pants, like their everywhere pants. I've been wearing them a lot lately, and they combine the comfort of sweatpants with the look of, well, not being judged for wearing sweatpants all the time. I guess you could consider them fancy casual, but I just consider them great for any occasion. And if you're hitting the gym for the new year, Chubbies also makes great ultimate training shorts with split side seams and an extended liner to make sure your 2 to 4 weeks of working out will be comfortable and luxurious. You never know, they might keep you in the gym until Valentine's Day. And don't forget that Chubbies also has NFL gear for the postseason featuring playoff teams that are still in the hunt, with more coming later this year. Chubbies is here to help you take on 2025 in style, starting with the comfiest, most versatile gear you've ever worn. For a limited time, our friends at Chubbies are giving listeners and viewers of the show 20% off with the promo code Dan Murrell at checkout at chubbyshorts.com. That's 20% off your order with the promo code Dan Murrell. And as always, be sure to support the show and tell them that I sent you. No matter where the new year takes you, Chubbies has the gear to keep you comfortable and looking your best. Another of these 17 items that was agreed to was, quote, an all-hands in-person meeting before production resumes, which will include the director, the existing producers, the Sony representative, the approved producer, artist, and artist-designated representatives to confirm and approve a plan for implementation of the above that will be adhered to for the physical and emotional safety of artist, her employees, and all the cast and crew moving forward. Baldoni's lawsuit claims that this all-hands meeting, which occurred at Lively's apartment on January 4th, 2024, was not presented to him as such, although the attendees do match the required attendees that are listed in the document that Lively puts in her lawsuit. According to Baldoni's suit, quote, Lively brought Reynolds as her chosen representative. Notably, she did not request any attendees from her union, the Screen Actors Guild. Together, Reynolds and Lively blindsided the rest of the group with a list of grievances read aloud by Lively that were as troubling as they were fictional. Reynolds then launched into an aggressive tirade, berating Baldoni in what Baldoni later described as a, quote, traumatic encounter. Reynolds demanded that Baldoni apologize to Lively for actions that had either never happened or had been grossly mischaracterized. Faced with persevering in the face of extortionate threats versus shutting down a film halfway through production with all the attendant financial and reputational implications, Wayfarer had virtually no choice but to resume production and finish the film despite the newfound certainty that Lively was intentionally manipulating, distorting, and inventing, quote, facts to use as a cudgel against Wayfarer. It is crucial to note that the list of grievances read at the January 4th, 2024 ambush were new, separate, and apart from the 17-point return to production demands and were never presented to any of the parties present. Though Lively's CRD complaint misleadingly suggests the parties agreed to a list of 30 items, many of the items listed on the CRD complaint were new, entirely based in lies, and neither read nor provided to any of the parties, let alone agreed to. And I have to admit that I was tripped up by that as well, because that list of 30 grievances that Baldoni refers to are the no more statements that I also referred to in my initial video on the complaint, and I got them somewhat confused with the list of the 17 other claims that the producers signed back in November of 2023. Going back and looking at the documentation of the lawsuit, they are two different things, but it is easy to conflate the two. I can speak from experience. One area where Lively and Baldoni agree is that the rest of the film shoot in early 2024 was completed without incident, but Baldoni claims that in post-production, Lively once again began to assert herself, this time over the edit of the film. It began with requests to view dailies or the raw footage that was shot during production. Baldoni includes text between himself and Lively where she thanks him for sending selected footage, then asks when she will have access to all the footage. Baldoni further claims that Lively went on to request joining him in the editing room while he was editing the film, which is also backed up with alleged text by Lively where she says, quote, "I'll be invaluable to you in recall alone as you put together what you're looking for. I've also been rewatching all the dailies, tons of nuanced gems. The sooner we put our heads together, the better." While Baldoni alleges that he had misgivings about allowing Lively into the editing room, he claims that he did it in order to keep production of the film on track. However, in the suit against the New York Times, Baldoni's lawyers claim that their collaboration soon became a one-way street. They write, quote, "What began as a 2-day collaboration extended into 10 days, during which Lively sought to work alone in the editing bay without Baldoni. Despite Baldoni incorporating 7 pages of her notes into his own edit at the very onset and consistently keeping her involved in every subsequent edit, Lively expressed dissatisfaction with mere collaboration, asserting that she too deserved the opportunity to see her creative vision realized. In response, Wayfarer flew Baldoni's editor to New York to assist Lively in the process. Eventually, Lively fired the film's editors, replacing them with her own choice, specifically an editor often used by Reynolds. She also fired the film's award-winning composer, replacing him with composers from Reynolds' recent project. Against repeated objections, Lively created her own cut of the film at Wayfarer's/Sony's expense. Sony later informed Wayfarer that Lively would not promote the film unless her demands were met. The 2 credited editors on the film do not appear to have ties to Ryan Reynolds. However, Shane Reed is credited as having done additional editing, and Shane Reed was the editor on Deadpool and Wolverine. The film also credits 2 composers, which is somewhat unusual for composers that don't work as a team, and one of them is Rob Simonson, who did do the music for Deadpool and Wolverine. So looking at the movie's credits, there does seem to be some credence to the idea that people who worked on Reynolds films and Deadpool and Wolverine were brought in to do work on It Ends With Us, but Lively claims in other statements that she was asked by Sony to do her own cut. So she's not denying that she did work on the film, just the nature of how and when she was asked to do it. Baldoni claims that he worked on his own cut of the film in parallel while Lively worked on hers, and that the finished movie is a combination of his cut and Lively's cut. He also says that there was a test screening where both cuts of the films were tested with audience, and that his cut received higher scores from the audiences. He includes text that he had with one of his editors that indicates that the scores on his version were higher. He also says that the only reason that the final version was not solely Lively's cut is that Sony, the distributor of the film, talked Lively into allowing portions of Baldoni's cut to be incorporated into the final version of the film. As for Sony's role in all of this, Baldoni's suit includes a text allegedly from a Sony executive to producer Jamie Heath, asking him to allow Lively to continue editing the film on her own, and saying that they're afraid that she will delay the release of the film by not approving the final cut, as well as not promoting the film and changing her mind about asking Taylor Swift to contribute a song to the soundtrack, which she eventually did. The text from the executive says in part, quote, "You guys don't want to play ball. You're going to delay and greatly hurt the movie. Good luck. Finish director's cut and we can have multiple previews down the road." Finally, we come to the last major component of this saga, which is the Dueling smear campaigns. Lively alleges in her suit that Baldoni orchestrated a smear campaign against her, along with his personal publicist, Jennifer Abel, and Melissa Nathan, a crisis PR specialist, that was meant to punish her for pointing out Baldoni's sexual harassment on set, by deliberately undercutting her on the promotional tour of the film, by planting negative stories about her in the press, and by artificially essentially boosting negative stories using something that's called astroturfing, which is basically to use fake users or bots to plant stories that look organic on different sites around the net. Baldoni, in his lawsuit, makes the opposite claim. He says he only hired a crisis PR team in case Lively decided to come forward with her allegations of misconduct, which he said he felt threatened that she would do. He also says that there were no negative stories that were planted in the press, that the backlash against Lively was all organic due to what they call her tone-deaf approach to marketing the film. And he also claims that it was Lively's publicist, Leslie Sloan, who was planting negative stories about him in the media, despite an agreement between Sloan and Nathan not to engage with negative stories or to comment on any negativity that was brought to them by the press. One of the key claims in both of their lawsuits surrounds the marketing of the film and the approach that both of them took to that marketing. In Lively's lawsuit, her lawyers say, quote, Ms. Lively and fellow cast members promoted the film in accordance with the marketing plan created and delivered by the film's distributor, Sony. Ms. Lively and other cast members were under a contractual obligation to render promotional services in accordance with the marketing plan. The marketing plan directed the cast to focus more on Lily's strength and resilience as opposed to describing the film as a story about domestic violence. Mr. Baldoni abruptly pivoted away from the film's marketing plan and the types of publicity activities in which he had previously participated. To that end, he and his team used domestic violence, quote, survivor content to protect his public image. So Lively essentially claims that she was following a predetermined marketing plan and that Baldoni is the one who went off message because he was trying to undercut her and make her look bad. But in Baldoni's lawsuit, his lawyers write, quote, Baldoni was marginalized from the marketing process. The purported marketing plan allegedly created by Sony, which was later referenced in Lively's CRD complaint as agreed to by all and attached as an exhibit as fact, even though it was merely talking points and not a binding contract, was never the plan Baldoni agreed to. In fact, against much resistance from the film's distributor, Baldoni from day one made it clear that he was making this film to bring awareness to domestic violence and would not refrain from doing so when promoting the film. He did not, quote, go rogue, as Lively alleges. Baldoni's suit claims that his intention was always to incorporate a partnership with the domestic violence group No More, and an internet search shows that he was involved with the organization since at least early 2023 when he appears in a post on their website thanking contributors to their No More Awareness Week, as well as a post on Instagram. Both of these were prior to the beginning of production on the film. The group also named itself as a charitable partner and supported the finished film publicly. Baldoni's suit claims without supporting documentation that, quote, Wayfarer partnered with Sony to co-finance and distribute the film. Their agreement included, at Wayfarer and Baldoni's insistence, that the provision was a deal breaker, a requirement that 1% of the film's proceeds be donated in support of survivors of domestic abuse. That 1% was ultimately earmarked for the organization No More, with which Baldoni had sought to partner with as early as September 2022. If this is true, then it does address one of Lively's, in my mind, most damning accusations, and one of the ones that is most publicly and verifiably provable, which is that she and many of the other cast members did not focus very heavily on domestic violence, while Baldoni very much sought to put it in the spotlight. Lively says that this was a calculated move to make her look bad, but if it can be proved in court that this was always Baldoni's intent when promoting the film, and it can also be proved in court that Lively was more in control of the marketing message than she claims to be and not just executing somebody else's plan, then I think that it undercuts one of the main theories behind how Baldoni was trying to smear Lively's reputation. As for the rest of the smear campaign, Lively's suit claims that Baldoni hired crisis PR specialist Melissa Nathan, who then went on to plant negative stories about her in the press in order to add on to the negativity that was already being generated. But in Baldoni's suit, he claims that she was hired basically as a defensive measure and includes several texts that he says shows that Nathan did not plant negative stories about Lively. In one of them, Nathan texts a TMZ reporter who asked for comment on a negative story about onset problems, saying, quote, do you have sources? Blake Lively's camp keeps thinking it's us placing these and we are doing F all. In another Baldoni texts Nathan, quote, definitely don't want to place stories and yet just want to change the narrative. I only said nice things about her and never spoke disparagingly of the cast, and so it's apparent the feud only works one way. And another Baldoni asks his PR team, quote, I've been seeing some IG comments on random posts defending me by people who are private with no followers and they feel like bots. Can you please confirm we are not doing any of that? I really don't want bots defending me as it feeds into their potential narrative, which is answered with, quote, I can fully confirm we do not have bots. This is also not what we do. Bots look fake to anyone. And in another text, Nathan sends Baldoni's publicist Jennifer Abel a negative story about Lively saying, quote, you did not do any of these. We did not do any of these. This is all organic. Stupid. Really stupid. And I cannot believe she didn't mention working with a shelter or domestic violence. None of this is your fault. It's breathtaking how tone deaf it was. Now, this could all have been done in order to establish a false paper trail should something like this arise, but if they're taken at their face value, these texts appear to show that at a minimum, bots were not one of the ways that the PR team was in favor of conducting their PR work, and also it appears to show that they were specifically directed not to plant stories and do some of the things that Lively alleges in her suit. In addition, Baldoni's suit claims that Melissa Nathan and Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively's publicist, actually had an agreement not to comment on any negative stories surrounding the production of the film. An alleged text between the two has Nathan telling Sloan, quote, I am not doing one thing without speaking to you. I'm not answering one email about this situation. I've told everyone to not do one thing /plant/seed /even speak to one reporter, even on background. Now I am involved here. There will be no shock surprises to you. To which Sloan replies, quote, me either. The suit claims that Sloan backed off of that promise minutes later when the Daily Mail contacted her to comment on a negative story about Lively, telling the reporter, quote, WTF is going on. The whole cast doesn't like Justin, nothing to do with Blake. They are panicking as the whole cast hates him. Now, two professionals who may see each other as rivals lying to each other about what they're doing, that's nothing new, but I think what this does do is, again, cast into doubt the veracity of the claims made by both PR specialists, because the text where Sloan is talking to the Daily Mail reporter certainly seemed to show her going back on what she told Nathan. But keep in mind, and I mentioned this in the previous video, Nathan was also talking to a reporter from the Daily Mail, and according to the time dates on those texts, those conversations were happening prior to what she was saying to Sloan. So it appears that neither one of these PR reps were doing what they actually told the other one they were doing regarding talking to reporters. Baldoni's suit, in which Nathan is also a plaintiff, does not directly address some of the most damning texts that were included in Lively's lawsuit, including the one where Melissa Nathan says, quote, we can bury anyone, and also the one where she and Abel talk about putting the, quote, social combat plan into motion. But there is one text that is specifically addressed, and that is a centerpiece of Baldoni's case, both against Lively and the New York Times. The text in question involves the Daily Mail and appears in Lively's suit, where she shows texts between Jennifer Abel and Melissa Nathan that appear to show Abel congratulating Nathan for getting a negative story published, saying, wow, you really outdid yourself with this piece, followed by Nathan saying, quote, that's why you hired me, right? I'm the best. That leads to what I am now calling emoji gate, but which actually, no joke, also leads to what Baldoni's lawyers call doctoring of the original text messages, because as presented in Lively's case, these texts exclude an upside-down smiley face emoji in the original text, a text that is included in its original form, allegedly, in Baldoni's suit. The emoji appears after the phrase, you really outdid yourself with this one, and according to Emojipedia, the upside-down smiley face is commonly used to convey irony, sarcasm, joking, or a sense of goofiness or silliness. And Baldoni's team claims that the exclusion of this and other text message exchanges to which they say the New York Times also had access paints Nathan's actions as evidence that she was planting stories, when in fact the conversations were making fun of the idea that she was planting stories and underlining that Lively's backlash was self-generated. And if you think it's insane that multiple multi-$100 million lawsuits may come down partially to the inclusion or exclusion of an emoji, welcome to Hollywood, because in Baldoni's lawsuit, his lawyers write, quote, On information and belief, Lively and her team used cherry-picked text messages stripped of context and even manipulated to peddle a narrative that plaintiffs had responded to Lively's complaints about purported sexual harassment by plotting to destroy her reputation through a shadow smear campaign. Apparently, the New York Times credulously accepted the narrative wholesale while making little or no attempts to investigate the veracity of that narrative. By telling the New York Times a false and damning story about an insidious PR sabotage operation deployed as revenge for sexual harassment complaints, with the knowledge and intent that the newspaper would publish that false story, Lively and her co-conspirators committed the tort of defamation. Baldoni also claims that Lively actively turned the cast of the film and the book's author, Colleen Hoover, against him as the movie's release grew nearer. The suit reads, quote, "As the premiere of the film approached, Lively made good on her promise and instructed Sony that she and the cast would not participate in any marketing or promotion of the film alongside Baldoni, in spite of Baldoni and Wayfarer's acquiescence to all her demands. Lively and Reynolds also unfollowed him on social media, as did the author of the book. The other cast members also unfollowed Baldoni, creating the false impression that Baldoni had done something wrong. On information and belief, Lively induced the other cast members to shun Baldoni in an early attempt to give fans the impression that Baldoni had committed an egregious sin. Lively was leaving what she had earlier referred to as crumbs, a social media strategy she had learned from a close celebrity friend, to give fans just enough to allow them to come to their own conclusions, thereby launching an army of detectives that, on information and belief, Lively hoped would turn against Baldoni." And the information and not so much the belief part of this is what I am interested in seeing, because this was one of the most compelling cases and one of the biggest unanswered questions for me when we talk about what's going on here, which is, okay, Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, obviously there's something going on there, but if Baldoni is as innocent as he claims to be, why did all the other cast members and the book's author, Colleen Hoover, unfollow him and do all these things before the release of the movie and vocally back Lively so quickly after she came forward with her allegations? It doesn't make Baldoni look very good, which is exactly what he says in his lawsuit. And his legal team posits a theory in the suit saying, quote, "Lively may have wanted to seize control over the film so that she could take over the production of the sequel, It Starts With Us. This motivation also explains why the cast, who may have hoped and or been promised a role in subsequent productions, would choose to side with the powerful couple who themselves may genuinely believe they could destroy Baldoni and Wayfarer and force them to cede or even sell the rights to the sequel." This is definitely a theory, but not one that is based in any kind of fact, at least not as shown here in the lawsuit. So this is an aspect of the case I'm going to track very closely as the story progresses. In what Baldoni's suit characterizes as one final insult, he claims that he was nearly excluded from the premiere of the movie that he himself directed and helped to get made. The lawsuit claims, quote, "Lively initially refused to permit Baldoni's attendance at the film premiere. Only after significant pressure did she reluctantly agree to allow Baldoni and the Wayfarer team to attend, but under humiliating conditions. The Wayfarer team and their families, including Baldoni and Heath, were segregated from the main cast, barred from the exclusive after-party, and forced to organize their own event at additional cost. Baldoni's participation on the red carpet was cut short, and his family and friends were confined to a makeshift holding area in the basement before being escorted into a separate theater after Lively's departure. This is backed up in Baldoni's civil suit by text messages to friends and loved ones, as well as pictures of himself and his family celebrating the premiere and what is described as the basement at the premiere venue. However, this premiere also includes an inconsistency between Baldoni's two lawsuits. In his first lawsuit against the New York Times, when discussing the movie's premiere, his lawyers wrote, quote, "Baldoni later received word that during the premiere of his movie Deadpool and Wolverine, Reynolds approached Baldoni's agent at William Morris Endeavor and demanded that the agent, quote, drop Baldoni. The wielding of power and influence became undeniable. Baldoni and Wayfarer grew increasingly fearful of what Lively and Reynolds were capable of as their actions seemed aimed at destroying Baldoni's career and personal life." And it's this incident that Baldoni credits partially with his decision to hire Melissa Nathan. However, shortly after the lawsuit was filed against the Times, a representative from William Morris Endeavor made a public statement denying that this happened, saying, quote, "In Baldoni's filing, there's a claim that Reynolds pressured Baldoni's agent at the Deadpool and Wolverine premiere. This is not true. Baldoni's former representative was not at the Deadpool and Wolverine premiere, nor was there any pressure from Reynolds or Lively at any time to drop Baldoni as a client." And interestingly, the civil suit against Lively changes the telling of this story. And this one, Baldoni's lawyers claim, quote, Baldoni later received word that during the premiere of his movie Deadpool and Wolverine, Reynolds approached Baldoni's agency, namely an executive at WME, and expressed his deep disdain for Baldoni, suggesting the agency was working with a, quote, sexual predator, a phase that uncoincidentally later appeared in the press, and at a later date demanded that the agent, quote, drop Baldoni. This inconsistency could be the result of Baldoni misremembering the event, but it is an inconsistency. And as I mentioned before, any sort of inconsistency or provably false statement that's made in any of these cases only gives the other side's legal team more leverage to work and discredit other claims that were made in the case. Regardless of which version of the story you go with, it still contradicts WME's claim that no pressure was ever given by Reynolds or Lively to drop Baldoni as a client, which did happen in December after Lively filed her original complaint. 1 week after the movie's premiere and the Tuesday after the movie opened, Baldoni alleges that the final piece of Lively's plan fell into place on a call between a talent agency executive and his publicist Jennifer Abel, as well as producer Jamie Heath. Baldoni's suit claims that a talent agency executive said, quote, the agency had spoken to Lively and Reynolds by phone about the overwhelming tide of negative publicity that they had faced over the past days. Heath clarified that Wayfarer, Baldoni, and Heath had no connection to the negative publicity, but they told Heath that Lively and Reynolds had demanded that Wayfarer put out a statement, quote, accepting blame for the problems during filming. The executives told Heath and Abel that Reynolds and Lively dictated a statement that they required Wayfarer to put out, calling It Ends With Us a, quote, troubled production, and forcing Wayfarer to take, quote, accountability for the problems in the production. Abel and Heath asked that the executive clarify what exactly Wayfarer, Baldoni, and Heath were being asked to take accountability for. They admitted that Lively and Reynolds were simply upset by how social media had turned against them. Stunningly, the executive admitted that Lively and Reynolds brought the backlash on themselves, but that they were beyond reasoning with. He admitted that making constant threats was Lively and Reynolds' well-known modus operandi, and that their demands were not based on reality, but on finding someone to blame for their social media crisis besides themselves. Elsewhere in the suit, Baldoni's lawyers write, quote, multiple WME executives acknowledged that in their experience, Lively and Reynolds' threats were not to be taken lightly, though admitting to false, vague, and unspecified mistakes would be tantamount to admitting to career-ending misconduct. Baldoni, Wayfarer, and Heath refused to apologize for sins they had never committed. They took a stand knowing full well that Lively and Reynolds would bring the full might of their celebrity artillery against them, and that is precisely what happened. Whoever these talent agency executives are who were on the call, they should probably clear their schedule for a deposition pretty soon, because if this accounting of this phone call is somehow proven to be true, then it undercuts Lively's entire case. However, right now, this is all hearsay. There's no way to verify that this version of the story ever happened, that any version of this story ever happened. This all goes down to proving it in court, because this is a pretty outrageous claim that's being made by Baldoni and his fellow plaintiffs. Now it is on them to prove it. And if the lawsuits on both sides of this equation are any indication, this is a legal process that is just getting started. Baldoni's team has even involved Disney in the lawsuit, sending them a memo asking them to, quote, preserve any and all documents relating to the development of the Nice Pool character in Deadpool and Wolverine, including without limitation all documents and communications relating to the development, writing, and filming of storylines and scenes featuring Nice Pool, any and all documents relating to or reflecting any deliberate attempts to link the character of Nice Pool to Justin Baldoni, any and all documents relating to or reflecting a deliberate attempt to mock, harass, ridicule, intimidate, or bully Baldoni through the character of Nice Pool. And Baldoni's legal team has said that they believe that Reynolds created the character of Nice Pool specifically to ridicule Baldoni, and they intend to prove that in court. Now, I think that with everything else on their plate, this is a lot to reach for. It does seem pretty ridiculous on its face until you see what Justin Baldoni looked like before he cut his hair short for the movie, which, you know, I'm not going to say there's no resemblance between the two, but I think a big part of whether or not this proves to be true or not true is going to come down to when the character of Nice Pool was created. Was it written before the strike or after the strike, before production began on Ends With Us or after production began on It Ends With Us? It just seems like kind of a crazy thing to spend time on, given how many other serious things these lawyers have to do. Lively's legal team responded to Baldoni's civil suit with a statement reading, quote, "This latest lawsuit from Justin Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, and its associates is another chapter in the abuser playbook. This is an age-old story. A woman speaks up with concrete evidence of sexual harassment and retaliation, and the abuser attempts to turn the tables on the victim. This is what experts call DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim offender. Wayfarer has opted to use the resources of its billionaire co-founder to issue media statements, launch meritless lawsuits, and threaten litigation to overwhelm the public's ability to understand that what they are doing is retaliation against sexual harassment allegations. They are trying to shift the narrative to Ms. Lively by falsely claiming that she seized creative control and alienated the cast from Mr. Baldoni. The evidence will show that the cast and others had their own negative experiences with Mr. Baldoni and Wayfarer. The evidence will also show that Sony asked Ms. Lively to oversee Sony's cut of the film, which they then selected for distribution and was a resounding success. Their response to sexual harassment allegations, she wanted it, it's her fault. Their justification for why this happened to her, look what she was wearing. In short, while the victim focuses on the abuse, the abuser focuses on the victim. The strategy of attacking the woman is desperate. It does not refute the evidence in Ms. Lively's complaint, and it will fail." Baldoni's team responded to this with another statement saying, quote, "The mere fact that Ms. Lively feels that she can publicly destroy Mr. Baldoni's reputation in an attempt to devastate his future career and then deny him or his team their own ability to defend themselves against her is preposterous. Mr. Baldoni never once publicly attempted to call Ms. Lively out for her own many wrongdoings during filming. He kindly addressed all her concerns during filming in the correct manner, despite the fact that he wholly disagreed. He himself was committed to do things differently and to keep the peace, as she specifically admitted to in her own lawsuit. We will not only continue to defend our clients against Blake's power, privilege, and all-out lies, but we will now fight even harder for the voiceless in the domestic violence community who are unfairly suffering while she continues to push on her own self-serving and selfish vendetta in the media." So what do I think about all this? Well, honestly, I think this is just a huge mess. I have to credit Baldoni's legal team for including what appears to be a fairly large amount of evidence that on its face at least mounts a strong refutation to a lot of Lively's claims in her lawsuit. And if they can prove in court that many or all of her claims are untrue, then that will obviously decide the case in their favor. As I mentioned before, I think that this evidence could be especially useful in their case against the New York Times for libel if they could verifiably prove that the newspaper had printed false information due to negligence. As for the two civil suits, they tell vastly different stories. There's really no middle ground between the two sides here. They each have their own narratives, and both sides have evidence that they say will back up their claims, and I think that there are unanswered questions about both of these cases. In my last video, I was accused of some of trying to both sides the issue of sexual harassment by drawing a false equivalency between Justin Baldoni's alleged harassment and Blake Lively's missteps on the marketing campaign. And I want to say clearly, and I think I said clearly in that video as well, that those are not two equal things. Sexual harassment and abuse is something that should absolutely not be tolerated under any circumstances. And if Lively and her legal team can prove that their side of this story is the truth, if Baldoni did do the things that Lively alleges that he did, then he should have to pay the price, which I'm sure will be very hefty. Lively does not name a dollar amount in her civil suit, but I'm sure it would also go into the hundreds of millions of dollars. However, if Baldoni is able to back up the claims in his lawsuits, and if he is able to prove that Lively has not been forthcoming in her version of events, then she is also going to have some very difficult questions to answer. And honestly, depending on what comes out at trial, I don't think that either side of this is really going to come out clean. That doesn't mean that I'm discounting the very serious allegations of sexual harassment here. I'm just saying that we now have two very differing accounts of what happened. Now the time for talking and lawsuits is over, and it is time for both of these legal teams to present their evidence and mount their cases. And whoever comes out on top, unless this ends in some sort of a settlement in which there is a non-disclosure agreement that is settled to where we never really know which side wins out over the other, whoever's on the winning side or whoever's on the losing side, I think that the losing side will suffer grievous damage to their reputation and their career, perhaps damage that might be nearly impossible to recover from. But we don't know right now which side that is. They've both made serious allegations of different sorts. One of sexual harassment, one of a targeted attempt to hijack and ruin a career. For many, this has already been tried in the court of public opinion, but now it's time for the real thing. So that is a very long, this video could be an hour long. I don't even know how long this is going to end up being. Summation of both what Blake Lively has said, what Justin Baldoni has said, and the stakes for what could be some blockbuster legal cases to come. I will continue tracking this as the months and who knows, maybe even years progress. As I said in my first video, I don't think I'm going to be giving this gavel to gavel coverage, but I do think that this is one of the most compelling stories happening in entertainment right now, not because of the more salacious claims, but because it touches on so many different elements of the entertainment industry. So I'll be keeping an eye and I will give you what I believe to be relevant updates as they happen in the future. However, I'll be doing a lot more here on the channel, as I always do, including box office news, movie reviews, Oscar news. The nominations are coming this week. I'll also have my predictions for who will be nominated for the Academy Awards this year. So be sure to stay tuned, hit subscribe, hit that bell to be notified. And of course, thank you so much for watching this video. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.